Have I been muted, or have I been?
No, we can hear you.
You can. Perfect. Thank you. We are a professional membership body. We have over 7,000 members worldwide. We provide education, training, and thought leadership. The focus of this particular interest group is on supporting purpose-driven organizations fulfill their social responsibilities in an ethical and sustainable manner. And in fact, our thinking in ESG has been informed by interaction and study with a number of organizations, institutes, including those represented on the panel here today. So I think we're all aware that governing bodies have challenges. They have a whole set of changes in the social context. We have the environmental crises, health crises, energy crises. And in addition to the fiduciary and legal responsibilities that governing bodies have a responsibility for, they also have social responsibilities. At least we're becoming increasingly aware of that. And these can be illustrated by the number of stakeholders that we need to be accountable to. This is part of good governance, essentially. In terms of guidance, where do we go? As well as forums such as this, there are standards, a whole host of standards, and we'll be focusing in on them. Standards provide a framework and terminology for collaboration and cooperation to address some of these global challenges, and also in meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which some of your organizations will have focused in on, particular goals that they may be interested in. And I know our first speaker will be talking about the work of the UN. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Professor Albert Weil is Emeritus Professor of Political Theory and Public Policy at the School of Public Policy at University College London. Albert will be speaking about social values and accountability. Over to you, Albert.
Thank you very much, Anita, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. Could I have the first slide, please? So my starting point is going to be that businesses have great power over people's lives. And I know it doesn't always seem like that when you're inside the organization and you're dealing with a difficult personnel problem, or you're having difficulty meeting your budgetary targets, or you've got a particularly awkward board member who keeps interfering in things. But nonetheless, investment decisions, procurement decisions, product standards are all aspects of business activity that can affect people, workers, suppliers, neighborhood, the environment, for good or ill. And the question is, how can one think about that? How can one decide whether the power that business has is being used wisely and responsibly? Could I have the next slide, please? So the idea that I'd like to suggest to you this morning is to think about business as being as operating within the framework of a social contract. Now, there are many different ways of thinking about social contracts, which is why I published a book a couple of years ago of over 400 pages trying to set out those different ways. But I think the core idea is really quite simple. And that is that you should be able to relate, whether as a business or as an individual, you should be able to relate to others in society on terms that you can mutually agree. Now, that may involve compromise. I mean, one of the important things I think about thinking about society as a social contract is you don't have to give up your own justifiable interests. You have a legitimate interest in your own interests, so to speak, but you have to be able to have a fair compromise with other and competing interests. And one of the ways of thinking about that is to say, could you explain to others the principles that guide your action? So you might say, well, when making an important decision, you would ask yourself, how would I explain and justify that decision to an intelligent and articulate representative of, let's say, workers or suppliers or neighbours who live in that area or other affected agents? And of course, it may be very difficult to find agreement. Agreement is hard. But if you can look others in the face and offer your best explanation as to why you've chosen the policy that you have, I think you've started to discharge your duties of accountability within the social contract. Could I have the next slide, please? So Anita's already alluded to the role of the UN in this, and I know that some of you will be aware of the UN Global Compact, but that's a voluntary initiative among CEOs of organizations committed to implement universal sustainability principles and to take steps to support UN goals. And I think that I like the idea of the Global Compact, not least because it's a form of social contract. It's a voluntary agreement among actors to adhere to certain high standards. But I also like it because I think if you explore this website, it begins to provide a framework of thinking and of talking about how business responsibility might be exercised. It doesn't give you pre-packed answers, of course, nothing does, but I think it does provide a set of principles and guidance that one can reflect on and apply to one's own circumstances. Obviously, what I've said is extremely general. I think you'll be hearing in the rest of the session about practical ways to operate within a framework of accountability and to play one's part in the larger social contracts that stretch from your own locality to the global order. But I hope you think that this way of thinking about responsibility as an exercise under a social contract is a valuable one. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. And that's helped me in terms of my understanding and sort of navigating the discussion that happens around purpose-driven and profit-driven organizations. And then from what you're saying, Albert, it's not incompatible. No,
indeed. And that I think goes back to my point that I was trying to make, that I think one of the advantages of thinking about this in terms of a social contract is that one has one's own interests, and those are properly exercisable within the framework of a social contract. It's not, you're not asking people to be altruistic, rather to play fair, and I think that's an important element of that.
Okay, excellent. Look, if that's prompted any questions, there is a Q&A function. Let's start getting ready for the Q&A session, so do put your questions in there. Over now to our second speaker, Professor Parosha Chandran. Parosha is Professor of Modern Slavery Law at King's College London. She's also a human rights barrister and parliamentary advisor. Parosha will be speaking about the risks of modern slavery. Over to you, Parosha. There you're unmuted.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anita, for inviting me to speak today. So I've got a snapshot of about 10 minutes to tell you all something about what is human trafficking, modern slavery, why is it important, and how it can infect supply chains and abuse and harm human beings. So just starting with estimated figures, an estimated 40 million people live in modern slavery conditions globally, including 16 million in the private sector supply chains. Human trafficking is basically the bringing of a person into a condition of exploitation. So it's the recruitment, the receipt, the transportation, the transfer, and the harbouring. So that's the holding of a person before or at the place of exploitation. And usually in the case of adults, this is achieved through using one of the means: deception, coercion, abuse of a position of vulnerability. That's usually attached to somebody's impoverishment, lack of choices, and maybe even in relation to a gender inequality or a group of persons that may be discriminated against. And so, again, their choices are much limited. So with that, and what is modern day slavery? Modern day slavery is just an umbrella term for a lot of legal terms: human trafficking, forced labor, slavery, servitude. That would include domestic household servitude as well. Also removal of organs. And the interpretation of modern day slavery really can be the holding of a person or the keeping of a person as if they were owned. I just want to tell you about a few cases that I think will be relevant for your consideration. The first is a US case called Signal. Remember Hurricane Katrina and how it devastated the southern states' infrastructure? Well, Signal International was a marine repair company, and it brought into the southern states of America South Asian men who were skilled labor providers. But it did so having lied to them about what the conditions would be like in America when they were working, and also lying to them about getting green cards when actually they would only ever be temporary workers. These workers came through recruitment agencies, and they were required to pay $10,000 and $20,000 US before they even arrived in the state. So they had already indebted themselves to bondage, to the tune of them having to work for this company, which they thought they would be able to get decent salary and wages. They were actually held in concentration-style conditions, separate to domestic workers, national workers who were working on the same sites. They had to work all hours. They weren't paid properly. They were abused, assaulted. They were threatened with deportation when they made complaints. One or two of the workers even considered suicide because of the debt bondage that the family was under for having them brought into the country for what they thought was legitimate jobs. And the civil litigation was brought against Signal for the harm done to the workers and the trafficking of the men. Signal settled a number of the claims for a tune of $12 million US, and that was against the recruitment broker as well as Signal itself, and some other claims were also then successfully settled to the tune in total of 20 million. And then what did Signal do? It filed for bankruptcy. It had no reputation left. So this is a very stern warning as to what can happen if you traffic and abuse. And it's an important message that you yourselves working in business, in organizations, want to know who the organizations are that you are working with in your supply chain, right? Another case I want to tell you about is Chowdhury in Greece. This was a case that actually went to the European Court of Human Rights because Greece didn't settle the case well enough. I don't mean in civil litigation terms, I mean just in any terms. These were undocumented illegal entrants in Greece who, because of their vulnerable position, were easily trafficked into exploitation to work in forced labour in Manalada picking strawberries that could end up on any shelves of any supermarkets, that could be transported by any hauliers, that could be bought by any purchasers. But they again were held in egregious conditions of human rights abuse. They were threatened with armed guards if they protested, and indeed a number of them were shot at and injured. This happened in Greece just a few years ago. Because Greece didn't prosecute the offenders and the case failed in terms of even granting compensation to the workers of any decent sum, they were given 42 euros each in the Greek system. The case was taken to European Court of Human Rights, which held that these men and women had all been subjected to trafficking for forced labour, that there was a duty for prosecution of offenders, but also for reparation for the victims. And they ordered between 12 and 17,000 euros to be paid by the Greek government to each person who had been so harmed. There's a recent case which is in the news at the moment. This is a case against Nestle, Mars and Hershey, the chocolate brands. They've been accused of using child labour to get cheap cocoa. This has been a type of litigation that's been going on for years, unsuccessfully, but now it's taken on some speed and progress. And ultimately, what the case is about is that 7 of these world's largest cocoa companies have been accused of using child labour so they can continue to benefit from cheap cocoa. The case has not been thrown out. It involves 8 Malian citizens who claim they were trafficked as children to the Côte d'Ivoire to work on cocoa plantations. The defendants, Nestle, Cargill, Hershey, Olam, Mars, Mondelez and Barry Callebaut, They're named as defendants, brought in the case in Washington, and it's alleged they formed a venture to allow them to continue benefiting from cheap cocoa harvested by forced child labour. It's important to note that a 2020 study by the University of Chicago found that 1.56 million children are harvesting cocoa today, with the main countries for production being the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And Côte d'Ivoire is responsible for producing 40% of the global supply of cocoas. Whilst all of these companies are making pledges for years and years that they're tackling the issue of child labour within their supply chains, they're setting up educational systems for the children, they're helping house the workers, what they're doing is benefiting, it's argued, from unequal and unbargainable positions in the labour market, to the extent that in a very recent expose that was done by Channel 4 Dispatches of Cadbury's supply chain in April of this year, it's been shown that children as young as 10 have been working on illegal conditions on farms. And the point being is that the farmers earn less than £2 a day, and they can't afford adult workers. So the children are then brought in to do the work. So this is something that's really got to stop. And these types of litigation are being brought strategically, globally, to enable that to start to happen, i.e. let's stop trafficking children and vulnerable people into well-established, well-known supply chains, just to enable companies to profit and get away with it. The final case I want to tell you about is a very recent case where a case has been lodged against the UK government. Now, the PPE supplies during COVID included gloves, the rubber gloves that we all had to use, from a Malaysian company called Supermax. It was an approved supplier of the disposable gloves for NHS workers. But in November 2021, last year, the government said it would investigate the claims of modern slavery that had been made against Supermax in terms of the treatment of the workers in the supply chain of those rubber gloves. But despite that, a month later, a framework agreement was awarded by the British government to Supermax Healthcare Limited, which is a UK-based subsidiary of Supermax Corporation, in a contract deal worth £6 billion. So as a result, a legal case was lodged just recently, a couple of weeks ago, against the government, claiming it had failed to tackle alleged modern slavery abuse in the NHS supply chain. So it was lodged a couple of months ago, but just recently it's been given the go-ahead in the High Court for the action to be heard. This case was prepared by Wilson solicitors, representing a number of the current and former workers involved in the production of the gloves in the Malaysian factories, who've detailed allegations again of debt bondage, physical abuse and forced labour while working at Supermax. So in my closing remarks, what I want to say is that organisations need to care about people being trafficked and enslaved in conducting their businesses. What you know about a lot probably is transparency in supply chains and due diligence requirements. And all of those are, of course, critical legal responsibilities that you are in your organisation's duty bound to comply with. But there's a separate flip to this, which is litigation against corporations and those involved in the supply chains, which have enabled the human trafficking and abuse of highly vulnerable people, some of the most vulnerable people on our planet, just in order to enable companies to profit. And this now is taking up speed. It's all over, as you can see, even against the British government here. And what we need to recognise are the risks of harm to all, the victims of modern slavery, and indeed the reputations of the businesses themselves. My question to you, when looking at your supply chain, is who are you doing business with? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that is a message for governing bodies, and it touches on the challenges, because I know the UK government is committed, and Dave will echo this, I'm sure, to tackling modern slavery. But the real challenges are in terms of understanding and recognizing what's going down the supply chain.
Indeed, thank you.
Okay, I can see questions are beginning to come in. Excellent. So it's prompting discussion. If we can pause there on modern slavery and now talk about business continuity. Our third speaker is Dr. Gianluca Pescaroli. Gianluca is lecturer in business continuity and organizational resilience, and also director of the MSc in Risk, Disaster and Resilience at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at University College London. And Gianluca's topic is the gap between continuity management and societal responsibility. Over to you, Gianluca.
Hi everyone and good morning. Can you hear me properly? Perfect. So I will use my time slot to give you an idea how things that are apparently not connected together are instead completely and definitely complementary. What we learned in the last 2 years is that no organization is an island. This was something known for a long time for scholars and even some practitioners, but this became a reality that is under everyone's eyes and is in your shopping chart. Is when you go in the supermarket, if you go outside, if you go abroad, and the implication of this is resilience. Okay, we are all interconnected, but the interdependencies and the interconnection implies that the supply chain, our action, are all creating consequences and cascading effects if they are disrupting on each other. I was speaking yesterday in a panel and I had some very good questions about how we are dealing with it, what we need to do in terms of societal prioritization. Think about your own experience during the last 2 years. How much your priorities are completely different because somebody else, maybe your neighbor, couldn't go to work because he was sick, or one of your employees or one of your colleagues, and you had to take cover on them, or your students. We had students that were sick, we needed to do extra support. I mean, the challenges are all these interdependencies, and the interdependencies though, and the disruption that the interdependencies amplify, bring us to consider that societal implication of each act we do need to be considered in terms of how to manage disruption, but also how to create societal resilience. Every time we put our feet in these kind of topics, we are tempted to think about just emergency response, the field where I come from. But we are seeing that as we are evolving the state of art, and as we are evolving the concept and the notion, short-term and long-term merge together, because we cannot have in the medium term, longer term, continuity management, emergency planning, right? Recovery without considering bridging and adapting. So without considering which are the factors that will enforce response independently by the primary threat, but will allow us also to be more flexible to whatever it comes next. It can be climate extremes, it can be the effect of an EMP in the outer space that struck down satellites, because we are in a very strange situation right now with hybrid warfare. And most of all, resilience and adopting the concept of resilience in this field and across fields is not just adopting a buzzword. We have the temptation often to include everything in that. No, this is not like that. This is something that can be very strict. It's not the solution to everything, but implies considering the linkages between organizations, individual, and their context. So when we are thinking about continuity management, we think about the consequences of the act we're taking for keeping organization running, keeping society running, keep first response running, and recovery. In terms of who is gonna take the responsibility of this, and what are the consequences of our acts about this definition of this responsibility. A critical point that raised in the last weeks is based on something we have seen in the theory we developed on cascading disaster back in 2016, is the problem of sustainability. The because sustainability is and lack of sustainability is the root cause of complex crises. We're seeing it in the supply chain, but we are also seeing all this in society right now with the effects and the cascading effects of, for example, of the war in Ukraine on food supply, on energy, on the finance. If we don't rethink the all that we are doing in terms of how to improve this, but to introduce new steps where an organization in Ireland, and there is a responsibility in this process, we are really at risk to see prices escalating more in the next years, in the next 10 to 20 years. So I don't have a very specific solution. I have a lot of things that we can do. We can introduce with the collaboration, for example, of the standard institution of the colleagues. Often are small acts that makes a difference. It's not necessarily rocket science. It's not necessarily, oh, we cannot do anything because, you know, nobody can oblige, for example, the car industry to shift immediately to something more sustainable, but we can take act in our choices. We can take act in our, we plan, how we take act in how we see and we require. If, for example, you are a leading organization, to your suppliers or to your clients, what are your requirements? For example, my colleague was talking about human slavery, introducing certain criteria in the whole supply chain that is going to make it more sustainable. Or starting to redefine together as a society, is it really long supply chain what we are going to deal with in the next 20 years? What can we introduce in that? And I'm speaking about supply chain just because it's the most visible with the food supply skyrocketing, with also the queue that were with Brexit. The all problems are together. And even when we're thinking just about a contract for a small disruption, think about that. You have an enterprise that is going to deal with a small localized power failure, but the consequence of this disruption is going to be felt by the employees of the enterprise, from the client. And if this organization, for example, a first responder organization that is actually mandate to a continuity management but can fail, for example, due to budget cuts, to a lack of stock of emergency close supply, like some hospitals that have a lot of background generator, maybe they don't have all the resources they need to keep them running or keep them trained. So the whole thing again are together. No organization is an island, no person is an island. And to find a way forward for the future and to progress and to face the complex and dynamic environment we are going to face in the next now 10 years, we need to work together. And I think my time is over.
Excellent, thank you. And on your point about solutions, well, at that point, we really need to turn to David Adamson, who is the Lead Standards Development Manager of Governance, Risk and Resilience at the British Standards Institution. And David will give us an insight into the relevant governance and risk standards to tackle some of these challenges. Over to you, David.
Oh, thanks, Anita. So I have some just one slide. There we are, lovely. So we can, that's me. Thank you for having me. Next slide, please. And anticipating that the next slide, I just say that some of the standards that I'm alluding to here have been covered very nicely by our speakers. So very, very nice tie-in. I don't have to elaborate too much on the first one here, given what Gianluca just said. The British standard that published in 2007 was a landmark standard on continuity. And you can see at the top there, where it's a BS EN ISO. That means that it's gone through the different phases. So it went to the European, then it went to the international, and it had a publication in 2012, subsequently revised in 2018. So what continuity is, Gianluca just said it there, but a lot of people believed at one point that it was recovering, simply recovering from an incident or a disruption. Now that can be certainly debated, and it has been. Part of that debate resulted in the publication of the next standard on crisis management. Now I know Emily is an authority on that. She's with the Crisis Journal, so we'll leave that to her. But that's about to publish. It's going to publish at the end of this year. To give credit where credit's due, it started off actually with the Cabinet Office, the UK Cabinet Office, and they sponsored what was a precursor to a standard. It led to 11200, very popular. It substantiated this belief that there's a difference between an incident and a crisis. And I think that's been withheld, supported by evidence of, in the pandemic, where people now say crisis, crisis, crisis. So we know that there's a distinction. Crisis, we're defining it as an extraordinary event that threatens the very existence of the organization. So existential type of stuff. Then underneath that, you've got 65,000, which again, Gianluca just mentioned, fascinating subject, resilience, because it's used in every other phrase a lot of times, these days in business and on the news and society. But BSI, when it was published in 2016, it was very difficult. It remains very difficult to write authoritatively on this, for whatever reason that is. But in 2014, they came out with a standard. It was guidance, and it really just listed the capabilities, the attributes of how to build resilience. It's kind of a softly, nonetheless, a very, very well received standard. The ISO followed, and interestingly, the UK did not adopt the ISO because they felt that the British standard was actually better in some regards. They both coexist. By the way, if you want a snapshot of what these standards are, you can get a freebie, a nice freebie. If you look into iso.org and just put in the standard number, it will give you a table of contents, the introduction, and sometimes even more, some key figures. And it's sort of a preview function. Often it certainly gives you enough that you learned what that topic is about reasonably and adequately to know certainly whether you want to purchase it, because these standards they're not for free. Not at present. They were during the pandemic, many of them, but now they're not. So going on then to the governance. The governance, interesting thing in 37,000, it was a landmark standard. It was based on a British standard. The British standard was direction, control, and accountability. This standard really took it to the next level. So without going into what that is, given the time, but it was a landmark standard on organizational governance, and it does absolutely tie in with ethics. The need to have your organization not only demonstrate, but do the right thing. You demonstrate the needs and of its interested parties and stakeholders. Just quickly, Parosha, she mentioned modern slavery. We've got again a very interesting standard about to publish in August on modern slavery for the reasons that she described, or what it is. But I would say this, that the reason to look into this particular standard is, you'll get maybe a few case studies, but it describes what modern slavery is and prepares an organization or helps an organization to manage the risk of modern slavery. Again, time doesn't permit going any further into that. There's a couple of other items there on safeguarding, which is coming out, human rights due diligence. So I have to unfortunately leave it at that. But the last one is risk management. That standard 31,000 on risk management was the de facto standard on risk management globally. Whether it still is, I don't really know. I wouldn't put my hand on heart to say it is anymore, but at one point it was the authoritative document that defined risk, the processes, the framework, the terminology around risk management. Of interest, they're working on emerging risks. So last slide, or only on slide, please. And that is just to say that British standard, we do a lot of standards. We're the UK standards body. And to participate, we need volunteers such as yourself. So please do consider it. There's a link at the bottom of that slide there. Again, it's voluntary, there's no costs, but you don't get paid either. But we very much support academics, government bodies, NGOs, professional associations, co-opted experts. And we really do appreciate your help. So thank you, and leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. 2 points from me. In terms of risk professionals, absolutely there's the risk management standard, but risk is integrated into every standard that David has set out. And by the way, these slides will be on the ESG webpage after this event, so you can reference that as well. And I know in terms of the modern slavery, risk management and risk assessment is absolutely pivotal to that. It's central to the thinking. And also, I would encourage you to get involved in standards making. It's been a great honor for me to be involved, and working with David, of course, is an added bonus. So I would encourage you to look at the options for getting involved in standards making. Okay, before we actually just move over to the Q&A session where you will be able to put your questions, and please start thinking about them. So we've got an array of subjects to discuss. Let me turn to you, Emily. You've listened very patiently and quietly with great interest, I'm sure, around the session so far. What are your thoughts?
We have, thanks to the panelists, we've covered so much in such a short time and such a wide-ranging aspect of this. And I think my thoughts, I'll try and put them in some sort of coherent order for you. We're living in risky times. We're living in an era of hyper-transparency and hyper-connections. And as Parosha said, reputational risk is an amplifier, and she provided some serious and heinous examples. But for me, it's about disintegrating trust. Without trust, we don't have anything. As consumers, we've got the right, we have to trust that when we purchase services or products, we're not funding exploitation of other human beings, damaging the environment or harming communities. As Gianluca says, our decisions are more influential than we think. And I consider that ethics are going to become increasingly discussed, especially in the light of natural hazards and organizational decisions. It's all about the social contract, as Albert said. And in that vein, I was reading, I'm sure everyone will be aware of the Edelman Trust Barometer 2022. The key findings were that businesses are once again the most trusted sector. But that's no cause for celebration in my view. It's just a measure of how distrusted other societal leadership sectors are, with journalists and politicians and coming at the bottom again. There's also a collapse in democracies. But what I found really interesting from this was that CEOs were expected to shape the conversation and policy on jobs, economy, wage inequity, technology, automation, global warming and climate change. And that's a lot of responsibility, but it's also good business if it's done properly. I was reading something in Bloomberg about it. The question was asked about ESG. Is it a tool for avoiding financial risk or for improving the world? And I'd argue that it's both. It's afraid, but you have to have, as David said and Albert said, you have to have that framework of accountability, and it has to be universally agreed, and people have to understand, and it has to be transparent as well. So I worry somewhat in terms of ESG that people might be worshipping a false god in some ways if it's viewed as a box ticking exercise rather than a systematic method of improving governance, reducing risks and acting in a socially responsible way. Equally, there's much more innovation in the private sector than there is in public bureaucracy, so it has to lead. And I suppose, as Gianluca says, and this is dear to my heart, sustainability is at the very heart of resilience. And disasters are a complex confluence of interactions and interdependencies. As he said, no organization is an island, no person is an island. And if we look at the interdependencies, when we examine a disaster or a crisis in hindsight, it invariably becomes clear that abnormal signals were present, the warning signs were there, but they weren't understood, they were overlooked, or they were just ignored because they were too complex and seemingly difficult to tackle. So I think I was speaking to Mami Mizuturi a couple of years ago, and she was talking about the SDGs, and she called it that vicious cycle of respond, recovery and repeat. And we need to break that cycle, put risk at the heart of everything we do, but not in a way that makes us risk averse. Rather, I mean, thinking about it in a more holistic way, understanding the secondary effects, the unintended consequences, and bringing in communities, and most of all, centering it around human beings. Because any organization, any community it works with, its customers, its shareholders, its influence, it's all about people. So let's use them.
Excellent, thank you. And in my eagerness to get straight to you, Emily, I didn't introduce you as Editor-in-Chief of the
That's fine.
Crisis Response Journal and Director at Crisis Management. Okay, equally in my eagerness to now move to the Q&A, we've got questions coming in. So the first one is for you, Parosha. Cadbury, this is from Thomas. Cadbury abandoned their fair trade certification back in 2016. They've since been using what looks like their own brand of certification called Cocoa Life, part of which ensures cocoa farmers can earn a better living, meaning a better quality of life for them and their families. Given the Channel 4 expose, how does this affect the Cocoa Life branding? Can they really continue to say cocoa is sustainably sourced through Cocoa Life, and Cocoa Life an unregulated way to preach fair trade to their customers? Is that something you can tackle, Parosha?
Yeah, sure. Am I live? You can hear me?
Yes. Yes, you're on.
I mean, I'm going to have to answer it more generally than just specifically towards Cadbury, because I think the litigation against other the brands in the US that has been brought, Nestlé and Hershey, etc., has really highlighted yet again that there's no opportunity at the moment for there to be slave-free chocolate. And so there needs to be reconsideration, I think, by Cadbury's of its audit scheme to take into account the findings that documentary exposed, and to look again at why there are gaps in its auditing that have not given rise to the information that has been so well documented by dispatches. You know, we're in an imperfect world, obviously, and I think when there is highlighting of slavery in supply chain in a company that has an auditing system in place, it's exposing that the auditing system is not working. So that's my answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Dave.
Yeah, I just quickly say I wouldn't comment on the particulars of that company either, but not to flog the 25,700, but this modern slavery, as we're defining it, whether it's forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriages, human trafficking, it's all around us. So it's actually more easy to spot in the big organizations. But when I went on a holiday recently to my hometown, there was a case of modern slavery there where someone was forced to work in a household. So it permeates society. So again, what the standard's trying to do, it's based on the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, but it's helping organizations to understand what it is, but then to prepare them to manage the risk. And when I say that, what I mean by that is that organizations need to understand the internal and external context in which they're working, which they're exposed, not only the supply chain, but the wider environment around them. So this standard goes into guidance. It's not a requirements or specification or meant for compliance as such, but it's to give people a really good insight, prepared by experts in this area. You know, I won't go into who they are, but that's what BSI does. It brings together experts to show what good looks like and how to do it without being overly prescriptive.
Thank you. So Dominic asks, well, it's Parosha, but I think equally as Dave has. Well, when is the modern slavery standard due to be published again?
It'll publish at the end of July, and the official launch, you'll see events in September, just because August everybody's on holiday.
Because Dominic is asking for recommended reading about modern slavery, human trafficking from a UK-centric point of view. And then also, which industry is this happening in the UK, and which ones have suspected problems? If we can, if Parosha, you can give us a response to that.
Yeah, sure. I can share some websites with Anita, if that's helpful, rather than just name some now, that are very good, particularly on business and human rights website that really shines light on what's going on, not only in the UK, but abroad. But there's, I mean, honestly, I've got a master's in law from maybe 25 years ago, 28 years ago, but I've got to say that Google is the mistress of us all. And I would just recommend, just Google modern slavery, human trafficking, UK 2022, and you will get so much information from 2019 to 2022 that is very apt, very relevant, very poignant, and pretty hard hitting.
And the NGO websites particularly have the statistics.
Yes, I mean, there's so many NGO websites as well. You know, if you're looking at children, look at ECPAT. If you're looking at international children, look at UNICEF. If you want to look at websites in the UK, there's anti-slavery. There's focus on labour exploitation, Flex. You know, there's so many. I couldn't even begin. So, in a way, I have suggested some now already.
So whatever you send through will go on to our webpage. Thank you, both David and Parosha. Next one, would you expect to see operational resilience as an ESG risk as opposed to an operational question mark? I think that's you, Gianluca.
So excellent question. I think in the medium long term, we are going to see a growing interaction between all of them. So I'm not sure to what extent this is going to happen, but I would expect that, simply because if we think it through, even with the stress testing, the things are integrating together. It's just we are deciding that right now there are some threshold in the responsibility and in the extent we want to see them interacting together. I already heard some corporates that are talking about the interaction between sustainability and continuity management. These are high-level stuff, and they are just literally some of the best ones that I know. But there is already some discussion ongoing. Then we can have a big question if you mean operational resilience at financial sector as I mean it, or if we are talking about operational planning, so tactical level continuity management. But in all cases, in both situations, I think that the two things are gonna be more consistently together in the future. If not now, within the next 5 years, something like that. That's the last my point of view. It's not necessary.
Okay,
What I hope.
thank you. And this is and that was Marguerite who posed that excellent question. The next one's more of a comment. Yeah.
Can I mention, you know, with the operational resilience and the organizational resilience, it was because Gianluca, you mentioned about the interdependencies and the interactions between the systems and the disciplines. When they moved from the 2014 version, which I said was, I didn't say simplistic, but I kind of meant simplistic, and capabilities and skills and attributes. Now they've actually delved into more the differences between operational and organizational resilience and these interdependencies. So it really touches on a lot of things that you said in the next version. It'll be a code of practice, and it'll publish at the end of July. 65,000 really highlights a lot of the things that you mentioned, Gianluca.
Oh, thank you very much. That's great to know. So it's a confirm that it's a confirm of it. But again, we are seeing in the sector that there are a lot of things that are associated with how society developed. It's just a matter of understanding how long things takes to make impact and to change practices. When I started the doctorate in 2014, I still had colleagues that were thinking that cascading was not a useful idea, and the concept itself and disaster were not going that direction. Apparently, they were wrong. Everyone does something wrong and right. They don't get it necessarily. But what we are really seeing is that society is not going to be more easier or simpler, and we need to tackle that, and we need to understand where we need to put action for a crisis to de-escalate instead of escalate.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, more compliments coming from Lisa, who brings us back to the societal perspective. And she says, I really like this statement from Albert, businesses have great power over lives. And then she goes on, how can we as individuals get more involved? So this is one for you, Albert, individuals and businesses in society. How can we make a difference, dent on the issue?
Okay, so thank you very much for that. Can I just pick up on something that Emily said, which I mean, she said so much, and this was one of the many things she said, which is the challenges to democracy that we're now facing. Because I think after the end of the Cold War, people were very optimistic about democracy, and they thought that the third wave of democracy would spread around the world and so on. In the last decade or so, we've seen that those hopes were far too optimistic. And that's important in the present context, I think, because you can ask yourself the question, who is the guardian of the social contract? And people used to think optimistically, well, it was government. I mean, the rest of us can just get on and do our thing, provided government sets the framework and sets the rules and so on, then it's fine. But when democracies are under threat and under pressure, those responsibilities fall on all of us. And I think it's absolutely right to raise the question of, well, how can we act? And I'm afraid I don't have any miracle cure for that. I mean, I think we just have to do what we can do as individual citizens. Write to your MP, join campaigning groups, blog, discuss with your colleagues, and so on. And as corporate actors, I think the first step is to try and understand where oneself stands and what responsibilities you can take on. And I think one important aspect of any political process, I mean, any political process, is that if the good people don't act, you can be jolly sure that the bad people will. So you can't simply let this slip and let's say somebody else can take this task on. So I'm afraid I'm sorry not to have a more sort of concrete, practical set of suggestions as to how to change the world. But all I can do is to stress the extent to which I think it really is a responsibility that falls on all of us, both individually and collectively.
Yes, quickly, Gianluca, because I got another one for Albert from Joseph.
Yeah, no problem. I would like to add just a couple of things on that. We often think that we are much powerless than where we actually are. We have seen that there was the push in the early 2000s when we were young. I mean, when I was younger, I'm doing lots of demos and risking to get in troubles with the police. But actually, we lost a lot of battles. But the way, for example, fair trade become a constant practice for a business is actually changed. In practical terms, for the continuity side and the social responsibility side, we are training a lot of students right now. We are educating them. We are educating society with this. And I'm sure that as soon as all of you that are asking yourself this question will start to acquire a minimum coordination role, you can start to change things. Maybe not at the maximum level because your CEO won't agree with it, but start with the small ones, because the small ones put themselves together and change the context. Again, think about all the differences in our life that are due to small action that puts together and then together and then together. For continuity management, it was a sector that was not even existing 20 years ago. It was like marginal. What I was doing, people were looking at me strange like 10 years ago. So again, ideas have the power to change. And you don't have necessarily to look at the big stuff. Start to introduce small action in your organization every day. Put them into practice, put them into culture.
Okay, so Joseph has a question. What is the panel's view on the thought that we are moving into a decisive business landscape where you have those who get the risks surrounding ESG and those who want to ignore the risks in the pursuit of increased capital? How can we as thought leaders influence the latter to change, or is it a lost cause? Perhaps, Albert, if I could ask you in a nutshell to perhaps reiterate what you've already said, or maybe offer additional thoughts on basically a mindset and people who get it and don't get it.
Well, I think there are others on the panel who are probably better placed to talk about this than me, but I mean, all I can say is that, of course, you simply cannot take for granted that things are moving in one direction. I mean, it's always a constant effort to make sure. I mean, that's all social transformation is a constant process. And I agree very much with what Gianluca said, that quite often major social change is the cumulative product of lots of things that happen at the individual level. So I don't think, again, there's no simple strategy that one can adopt. I think it's much more a question of sticking to the cause, repeating the claims, making sure that you're trying to move forward step by step.
Yeah, Emily?
Yeah, we've I'm not plugging it, but in our current edition that's just in press, we have a discussion that touches upon that by one of our advisory panel members. And he was talking about how it is inevitable, and this is not necessarily my personal view, but he's talking it's inevitable that some companies will be left behind. But the only thing that you can do is capitalize on the companies that get it and use them as an example and show the good practice, and hopefully you will bring others with you. It's not necessarily the perfect answer, but at least it's something, and it's really showcasing the companies that get it and that are responsible and showing the benefits that that brings as well.
Okay, Russell addresses a specific challenge that I think we see. Would the panel agree that while we have standards, there is a problem with how they are implemented? Too many times organizations don't have enough people with appropriate skills and experience, and that those auditing lack knowledge on emerging issues, and consequently we get a tick box approach. If you agree, what can be done to change this? And we're in the last minute, so any thoughts on that? Maybe David, if you start.
I don't have any thoughts, to be honest with you. It's a very difficult situation.
Okay. I mean, I have a view in terms of the tick box exercise, and perhaps it alludes to how Lisa's question of how you as an individual within your organization can bring about change. And I think that really comes down to, as risk professionals, challenging where you see irregularities, and using the standards, and as I say, we will put them up on the webpage, using the standards for you as particular guidance, and then informing your governing bodies as well, because we have all the information, and we've had CSR, we now have ESG. We're on a journey, but I think it's in forums such as this where we have the conversations and then inform people of the knowledge base that there is. Because that is really what standards are, aren't they, Dave? People coming together internationally to collaborate and put forward their best ideas. Yes, very quickly, yes. Parosha and Gianluca, final comments, please.
I do think when it comes to like evening out the playing field in terms of information and knowledge, each industry and each business is very much item specific in terms of what they're providing, what they're good, what their services is, etc. And I think in this day and age, there really is a question that could be the role of a human rights officer in organizations, not just big organizations, but actually in small and medium-sized enterprises, because the greatest risk of modern slavery lies deep in a company's supply chain, particularly concentrated within the operations. If you've got a human rights officer, you can actually ask them to actually look at what the risk areas are in your particular supply chain, and to enable knowledge and capabilities to manage the risk to be shared in the company. And when it comes to being a more powerful platform, to have companies collaborate together with best practices and moral leadership.
Yeah, that will I think that's the heart of it, is collaboration. Final point, Gianluca.
Super fast. Remember always standards of the baseline.
Yeah.
Okay. Baseline to be applied everywhere. Then wherever you are, use your creativity, your analytical capacity to see how far beyond you can go. Depending on your culture, your belief your CEO, just make the idea, the seed there, you can do better, more with your creativity, with your lateral thinking, ground it, let it grow, because you are the one aware of how your own operational reality is unique. Standards are important, are baseline to start from. They are not irrevocable. And the way they're
So we need to aim high.
exactly. So
Okay, perfect.
your own vision.
On that note, I have another comment from Russell. Plug the IRM leading on these things. Well, that'll be for others to judge. I've enjoyed the session. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to you for attending. Our next event, I should say actually to a number of people who didn't get your questions in, and I do apologize, you know, they're more than I thought we were going to get. But please do write to me. My email address is on the ESG interest group webpage, David, Kieran, Anthony, and I will forward your questions to the relevant speaker or speakers, and hopefully you'll get a response. So that just leaves me to let you know about our next event, which is a joint event with the IRM India Regional Interest Group, and we will be talking about ESG reporting, which is, I know, in many arena, the key driver. We've had a session on ethical and legal drivers today, so I think it's now timely to talk about the reporting as well. So thank you to the membership team and the marketing team in the IRM, plug the IRM. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to audience members for great questions and participating. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.